So I want to welcome you to the session on innovative regulatory pathways for next generation treatments. My name is Mark Lane. I have the honor of chairing the panel and my esteemed guest panelists as well. I am a Vice President of Development Consulting and Scientific Affairs at Biopharma Excellence, which is a part of the PharmaLex consulting family. What we've agreed to up front is I'm going to do introductions quickly so we can spend most of the time on questions. And much like the last session, we're going to have a few questions that we've prepared and we're directed at individual panelists. And then we'd like to get some questions from the audience if we could. So be thinking about what your critical, important questions might be. So our first panelist is Jennifer Dittman. Jennifer's the head of regulatory affairs for Generation Bio. Generation Bio is developing non-viral gene therapy platform targeting rare and prevalent diseases, so not surprisingly. And then Jeff Ross of Miromatrix. It's a regenerative medicine company focused on ending the organ transplant waiting list by bioengineering transplantable organs, so a very interesting approach. Miromatrix completed their IPO earlier in the summer and is targeting the second half of 2022 to initiate their first clinical trial with external liver assist. And then last we have Rachelle Jacques, who's the CEO of Enzyvant, and Enzyvant's focused on regenerative medicine for rare diseases. They just received their first FDA approval last Friday, one of the first three RMAT designated product approvals. So we're going to start the session by asking Rachelle to comment on her experience, focusing mostly on the regulatory point of view over the last few years. So, Rachelle?
Super, thank you. Thanks so much, Mark. And happy to see everybody here. It's been a while since I've been on a stage, and it's wonderful to see people in real life. To give you a little bit of background, Enzyvant is, as Mark said, working on regenerative medicines for rare diseases. And our first approval came through on Friday for Reimbursement. And Reimbursement is a novel tissue-based one-time therapy, and it is indicated for immune reconstitution in pediatric congenital athymia. So that is where a baby's born without a thymus, and without a thymus, they can't make functioning T cells. So these kids are severely immunodeficient, they have immune dysregulation, and unfortunately with supportive care only, which is what they've had up until this point, most of them will die by the age of 2 or 3 years old. So it is quite devastating, as you can imagine. And then Reimbursement is based on clinical data from 105 patients over the course of decades of research. And I think that's where the story starts for us at Enzyvant in 2016 when we licensed this interesting technology. We looked at what was the life's work of a researcher who had been studying congenital athymia and how to treat it, and essentially felt that the data was there to support a clinical package for a BLA submission. But as we know, that's not a typical approach to take data out of academia from studies that weren't necessarily designed for the purpose of filing a BLA and putting that together in a package that would be acceptable to the regulators. So we did, make the proposal to the FDA. They were open to seeing what we had. And that is how we went forward. So that was, I'd say, from an innovative regulatory standpoint, that was definitely a unique approach that we took, and we have very strong clinical data. And so that was great. But it presented another challenge for us, which was on the CMC side. As we know, the product is the process, and now we had a situation where we had clinical data that was based on a clinical stage manufacturing, and we had to upgrade that manufacturing to commercial, but we couldn't change so much that we were now disconnected from that clinical data. So that was a really interesting thing for us to navigate and a puzzle to put together. And just to be frank, we didn't get it quite right, 100% right the first time through. So we did receive a complete response letter in 2019 after a priority review. And I would say, the big learning from that for us was when you have a complete response letter, you have the right to a type A meeting with the agency. And we got a lot of advice about what that should look like, what timing, a lot of people suggested we go right away, meet with the agency right away. We decided, because we're working with tissue-based therapies, and this is really unique. We can't just kind of take things off the shelf and apply them to answer these questions. We had to innovate a lot of things. So we decided the best way to do it is actually put our full plan together, take our time, meet with the agency with an end goal of coming out of there with real clarity on what the roadmap was to execution, and that's what we did. So we took about 3 months before we engaged in the Type A meeting, and I would say that was probably one of the best things that we did. So, the end result now, I guess we know, and it was a very interesting journey with a lot of learnings, but we're doing a lot of innovation here, and so I think that's consistent with probably what most of you are experiencing. But great day for patients, and very happy to be able to share the news.
Great, thank you, Rachelle, and again, congratulations. We'll move to some of the questions that we've prepared. So first for Jeff and Jennifer, and related, of course, to Rachelle as well. It says, various regulatory agencies, as you know, offer the opportunity for different types of early engagement, such as interact meetings, the innovation task force, and other approaches in other regions. Curious, have you utilized these type of meetings, and what are some of the benefits that you saw? And maybe Jeff, if you could start.
Sure. As Mark made in the introduction, our goal is to bioengineer a transplantable liver. And a first step in that, since nobody's done this before, was really to be able to utilize some of those opportunities at the agency. So we took advantage of the Interact meeting, and I have to say from that, it was incredibly helpful. I think the challenge with the Interact meeting is really trying to figure out what is that timing, because today you only get one. So if you're looking at that, you need to weigh out what would be too early versus if you wait too late, you might not get the value and you might spend more time in your development process. So for us at Miromatrix, we went into that once we had enough preclinical data to really be able to get the directionality that we needed to have the confidence going into the pre-IND meeting that we'd be able to answer and address any of the questions that the agency had. So from that standpoint, we had a tremendous experience with it, both from the openness, I would say, from the agency on some of these new therapies that they just haven't seen before, their desire to collaborate, and really be able to help give you some of that guidance where it's non-binding in the Interact, but they certainly can say, at the next step, this is something that we're going to be asking you. So now you can come really well prepared, knowing exactly what those issues are going to be able to either strengthen your position or be open to other things. So for us, the Interact meeting has been tremendously beneficial.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, and I can, similar to Jeff at GenBio, we've also utilized the Interact process. And for us, the same, being a non-viral gene therapy, we are also new in the space. So just starting to build that relationship with the agency, getting some early intelligence, and then helping us really prepare for the pre-IND, and strategically timing that discussion as well, so we get the most out of it and that we're well positioned for an initial IND filing. It's been really useful to us to think about how we pursue that with our products, but then also thinking about our platform overall, and how we might leverage some of the discussions across different indications to make the best use of our time and the agency's time with some of these early interactions.
So, Rachelle, I'm going to come back to you, and we talked about this ahead of time, that the agencies do offer these chances for early engagement, but oftentimes the timelines don't necessarily keep up with the technology, right? The science is changing quickly. Maybe you don't have 3 months to wait necessarily to get your feedback, et cetera. So I was wondering if you could comment on what types of changes you might like to see from a development point of view with respect to those engagements.
Yeah, at Enzyvant, we haven't used Interact, and we will in the future, and I'm really happy that that's available to us. But when I think about kind of the benefits that come with the Interact meetings, I think that they apply to some other things that we could be doing along the way as we're actually, in the development process. couple of things that would have been very beneficial to us, and I think would be for many others as well, because when we think about, we're trying to move with speed. We're looking at rare diseases where patients don't have other options, so speed is critical. And anytime we can have clarity quickly, it's going to be beneficial for patients in the end without sacrificing safety or efficacy for patients. So I think a couple of things that would be specifically important. One is there a way that we could have more timely feedback on things like, protocol reviews, rather than requesting a Type C meeting and waiting for that, or not, and just kind of, putting it in and hoping that you're going to get a feedback eventually. For those of us who are working on these integrated programs, you can't just have one piece of your program waiting for a potential answer eventually sometime down the road. We've got a lot of things to be integrated and moving in a synchronized manner, and we need these answers as quickly as possible. So I think some benefits around faster feedback on protocols would be, in a more informal setting would be helpful. And then for the formal piece, what I found as well is, we might get in a formal meeting some feedback that is, potentially creating some substantial change that we need to make, and we, have the interactions in the formal meeting. But you go back and you work on that as a team, and you digest it and you discuss it and you look at the options, and inevitably you have follow-up questions. And I would love to be able to have the ability to reach out with these follow-up questions to that same team that was in the formal meeting. And I, both of those things are requesting more from the agency, and we know that they're under pressure, especially right now from a resourcing standpoint, and certainly a lot to deliver on the vaccine front. And so we try to think about what are some of the ways that we might be able to free up time. And I think we've had a couple ideas already here, but anything that we could do, for example, in frameworks, let's say on platform technologies and so on, where there could be a more standardized way of approaching those that would provide some efficiency from both the company standpoint and the agency standpoint, I think are the kinds of things that we think of that would free up time to be able to spend more time on some of these informal and rapid interactions.
Jeff or Jennifer, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I can comment. I know the platform framework is something we're also very interested in at GenBio. The agency has shown some interest in it because they also see the value in, not making the same comment on 5 different programs, making it, once and applying it to multiple programs. So there's still a little work to be done on how we get to that framework. But the thing I would just encourage folks to think about is, the more creative companies are in trying to propose some of these to the FDA, I think the further we will push some of these frameworks, in the way that we would want to see them evolve.
Great, thank you. So, Jeff, you remember in our planning session, you raised a point, and I think a very good one, and I'd like to ask you to comment a little further, how sort of the traditional clinical outcomes, measures of efficacy in development programs will often take many years to manifest or be seen. And so you're really taking years and years to get a treatment to the market, waiting for that outcome. What kind of changes might we take a look at and consider to sort of speed that up?
Yeah, I think the challenge, and Mark, kind of what you're talking about there is when we're dealing with some of these diseases or therapies or challenges where the patient has no alternative therapies. So if we look at some of the stuff that Rachelle's been working on or that we're doing at Miromatrix, we talk about whether it's acute liver failure or end-stage liver failure. There's no drugs, there's no devices, there's no dialysis for these patients today. So when we do look at, bringing forward a therapy, what are some of those opportunities either to fast track that or to move that through the regulatory process as fast as possible, where, to your point, Mark, we're not looking at a 5-year follow-up when during that time you have thousands of patients who have no access to therapies. I will say, in our interactions with the agency to date, they've been really open and collaborative on taking that into account when there are no other alternative therapies. I mean, their primary goal still is safety and making sure that that safety profile is in place. But then after that, some of the conversations or discussions that they have are are creative ways potentially in the end that one can look at this, whether that's conditional approval with a registry and following that in more of a traditional kind of a phase 4 type situation. So I think a lot of this is case by case. I will say, I mean, I don't think there's any solutions to it today. I would say in our own experience, the agency's been open and collaborative on having some of those discussions and really weighing that risk along with what that benefit looks like. I would say a key component to this, though, from a company standpoint, and I'm glad that the next session is on reimbursement, because you could move through this really fast and the agency could be great from that standpoint, but without the reimbursement as well, you would still have difficulties on how do you really deploy this to the patients that really need this in the end, and how do we deliver that therapy?
Great, thank you. And you raise a good point about reimbursement. Certainly a topic for a different session, perhaps, but certainly a very valid and important point to consider. I think we all know, right, and I'm going to ask each panelist to address this. In this field of advanced therapies, regenerative medicine, almost everything is in some way, shape, or form new and innovative. And we're often just keeping pace, or the regulators are just keeping pace with, the therapies, the technology as it's being developed. So there's often not a tried and true path to follow. So curious is, how can companies best work with the agencies to help shape some of these regulatory frameworks as they're being developed? Maybe Rachelle, we'll start with you.
Sure. I go back to the guiding principle is what's the fastest way to move forward for patients. So, kind of a speed matters mantra when it comes to these interactions and evolving the frameworks. And because we are doing so many new things, kind of frequent interactions and a continuous improvement is important, and yet we all know what that looks like when you're on the receiving end of changes while you're in the process. So when I think about what could be really helpful, I think locking in on some of the things that are known and getting some established ways of working on the things that are known, but yet still allowing the flexibility in areas where we're on a very steep learning curve. And I would dare say we're on a steep learning curve together between the sponsors and the companies, and the agency. And the great thing is, though, that the agency inevitably sees much more than what any one of us is going to see. And so figuring out the right way to get that cycled back in terms of expectations and clarity to companies so that they can act on that new information or learn from that broader view that the regulators have. I think this is kind of a mindset that we need to have as we continue to further these approaches. And maybe the last thing I'll say is it's still a question mark for me around CMC because we found ways to accelerate in other areas. We still haven't found the way to accelerate in CMC. So that's a remaining challenge for us.
Jennifer?
Yeah, so I think, as Rachelle said, the frequent interactions, and I think being strategic as companies think about these interactions, meaning, not just thinking about the near-term interaction, but some of the other future interactions and what topics you might want to address, because that may inform the near-term discussions you need to have with the agency first. And the other thing, which I know CBER has actually already moved to, is having more integrated discussions, so not talking about clinical without bringing in the CMC component or vice versa, but having these discussions holistically about the program so that the agency gets the full view and can understand, when they allow flexibility somewhere that speeds up the development, that they also need to apply some of that thinking to other components, because, one thing, the clinical piece could very easily get ahead of the CMC if they aren't seeing the big picture.
Jacques.
Yeah, I'd say just to add on that a little bit, I mean, in some ways it's coming at this from the tissue standpoint. It's kind of the blessing and the curse from the standpoint that the agency hasn't necessarily seen a lot of this yet. So they are on that really steep learning curve. So how, as a company, can you help them learn, form those relationships so you can have those levels of interactions to get some of those answers as you're forging that path really together as you go down that. I think one thing that you said, Rachelle, that rings true is the agency sees a lot more than any one company can see. And I think, that is the importance of ARM, right? Why we're here. And as a company, whatever stage you're at, is joining some of those committees where they actually have that voice with the agency, looking through some of these topics and trying to advocate for that. So as your therapy is coming forward, some of those existing tools might be there to be better utilized from the company standpoint. I think the other thing to look at, and this is something that we always try to do at Miromatrix, is there an intermediate step too? We know where we want to get to in the end. Is there an intermediate therapy or an intermediate step that would allow the agency to get more comfortable with your technology before moving into that next step? And for us, that's really been, as we look at taking bioengineering a liver and putting that all the way into the patient, we really looked at an opportunity with acute liver failure. Can we house this external to the patient? So now instead of we're looking at years of therapy, now we're looking at 3 to 5 days of therapy to start to be able to get clearer safety endpoints and efficacy in just that first experience, and then try to leverage that and those learnings to move forward.
Great, thank you. That's the end of the prepared questions that we had, and it's almost perfectly on time for what we had planned to allow questions from the audience. If you have any follow-ups to some of the questions that we discussed or any new questions of your own, certainly this would be a great time to bring them up. Maybe raise your hand. There's one here. Here comes the microphone.
Thank you. This is Mike Scott from Novo Nordisk. Increasingly, it seems that our products are being treated as combination therapies by the agencies, and that adds another level of complexity for compliance and also coordination between us and the agencies and inter-debate agency. What's your experience or your suggestions on how we can best approach this to improve efficiency when we're dealing with complex combination products?
Who would like to take that?
Yeah, I could start with that. So certainly as we're looking at this from a standpoint of taking a matrix, taking cells, putting those together, it comes up a lot, is this a combination product? And we looked at a lot of that, and you can actually make a request to designation to the agency to try to be able to get ahead of that a little bit, depending on where you want to land, whether you want that to be a combination from that standpoint, or otherwise whether you want it to fall into CBER. With the notion that this is still based, so you still usually have that notion of what's the mode of action, which is going to be the cellular standpoint. And there's really pluses and minuses of both sides, right? I think one of the challenges with a true combination device is your quality systems and other things need to address both of those, which becomes quite onerous from that standpoint. So we really took the tack to try to look at this and try to at least get that initial thought to designate this more, not as a combination, but to be able to have CDRH be able to also advise on that as some of our meetings. And that's been our strategy so far, and we'll see how that continues to play out.
Anyone else want to comment?
We haven't had that experience at Enzyvant, but one of the things, and just looking at some of the other things that are going on in the space, I think there's also, it would be great to have the flexibility, because I think that it's not just the regulatory question and the timelines that you need to think about, whether it's a combination or not, but also your commercial strategy and what do you want to do with do you want 2 assets going forward? Maybe that's a better answer, and it's worth, taking that approach to your regulatory strategy. But I think, those are things that ideally the company would think through and be able to propose a path forward that would be, beneficial for the long term.
There's a question over here.
Yeah, hi, Van Parker from Precision for Medicine. FDA has issued a series of guidances for rare diseases, for gene therapy in the last couple of years that certainly have been helpful. In terms of control groups and how we demonstrate that there's efficacy or safety in our drugs. But there's some conflicting things, such as how we enter into pediatric studies of when it's appropriate to begin studies in pediatrics. And I'm wondering if you can provide some insights into how, just guidances in general perhaps, but specifically when and how you've been able to get into pediatric subjects.
I'm happy to comment. Gen Bio obviously isn't in pediatric subjects yet, but one thing I would just say is, a guidance is meant to cover many broad situations, but there's probably a lot of disease-specific nuances. For example, when the disease impacts the patients, whether you can feasibly actually begin in adults, or whether adults have maybe progressed too far. And so I would just encourage, folks who are grappling with this question to think about some of those things and talk to the FDA about this. I think, the guidance, like I said, makes very broad recommendations, but if you have a specific disease where it actually makes more scientific sense to begin in children, then you should be proposing that to the agency and talking through how you justify that from a safety perspective, versus then trying to figure out how you might craft your program to the guidance if it doesn't make sense for the disease.
And in some cases, I think it's a matter of what is known about the disease or the condition, and being able to present some evidence of what happens, especially in the pediatric population, without a treatment. It might help to create, I think, the right understanding for a good decision there. And unfortunately, for a lot of these rare diseases, we just don't have that information, so it's something we need to, be able to study and pull together for a deeper understanding for all parties who are going to be making those decisions. In the case of Enzyvant, we're, working on, obviously, a situation where children are dying by the age of 2 or 3, so there's no question about whether or not to study in pediatrics. But I think, more broadly in rare diseases, having that understanding of the disease is so important.
Thank you. We have a question here.
Hi, Christoph Fink from Biopharma Software. Just a question. To what extent can IT and software and technologies, those technologies help you in your endeavor to speed up the process?
The question is IT? What is
IT and software. Mm-hmm. To what extent they can help and support you and speed up the process?
You guys want to take that?
I think, it depends on your process in terms of IT and certainly your quality systems. I mean, your question would resonate more from me on, throughout our manufacturing, what do those batch records look like? How do we do that? What are the important data points that we want to collect and then be able to submit, whether that's support for release criteria or other things. So we are continuing to look at how that evolves and what level that could provide additional support. But beyond that, I really think it's probably specific to what is your process, what are you trying to do, and what type of data do you need to capture for what you think for approval or the agency would want.
It's funny because the first thing I thought of was batch records as well, of all the things we could have thought of. But having a program that came out of academia, the batch records in our case are manual. They're paper. They're manual, and so when you're in a clinical study or in a clinical manufacturing environment, the batch records, just to give you a little example, were about binders of about 4 inches. Now in a commercial manufacturing setting, those binders are 4 feet long. So having electronic batch records is definitely an improvement in the process, but I think, getting those early and in the right setting, and in the case where we're dealing with academia, I think that could be a really nice improvement.
And maybe just one comment about IT from the clinical side. I don't know that we've fully realized the impact of real-world evidence yet. I mean, the agency has been talking about this for years, but one of the main challenges is actually around the data collection and standardization. So, if companies can get that right as we think about how real-world evidence might make a difference, particularly in some of the rare disease programs, that's another place where I think IT systems could be very helpful.
We have about time for one more question, if there is one. There we go.
Hi. Is this on? There we go. Jenna Dale, Cook Myocyte. I was wondering if you could comment on what manufacturers might be able to do in the event where if you have a long clinical development program, getting feedback from the agency along the way, but perhaps having conflicting feedback or different feedback from the agency over time, particularly due to turnover within the agency and differences of opinions between the reviewers, and maybe furthermore, if you can establish through your own clinical data throughout the pipeline, the program, which endpoints to use, if the agency disagrees with those endpoints, are there ways that you can combat that through your own clinical data and kind of pointing back to what you've been able to prove over time?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at the first part. I mean, you know, in terms of guarding against the differences of opinions within the agency, you know, it's a challenge, and there's probably no perfect solution. It's, you know, I know a lot of sponsors have seen this where, you know, hey, we talked to FDA 2 years ago and you told us this, now you're saying something different. You know, I don't know that I have a good solution other than to just keep at the frequent interactions. And when you do encounter one of these situations, I think there's a way to nicely discuss with the agency what the feedback was previously and try and get an understanding of why they're changing their mind. You know, I would find it hard to believe that the response would be it's personal opinion, it must be backed by data. But if you can tease out some of that, it may help you reach a common ground with the agency.
And I think it's unfortunate when this happens, but it happens in many of the programs that are lengthy. And part of it, though, I think is because the agency sees more and learns more about the program, and now they have a new insight. And maybe they don't tell you that that's the new insight that came to the new conclusion, so it can be incredibly frustrating. But, you know, having the dialogue might help to uncover that. And then once you understand the thinking behind, perhaps there's a way to move it forward differently, but still satisfying the concern or the need or the new question that's come up.
Great, thank you. We're out of time, but Jeff, if you have other comments later, maybe you can catch up. But thank you for your questions, and thank you to the panel, and enjoyed the session, and enjoy the rest of the meeting.